first speaker, has for 30 years operated a successful practice, Toronto-based practice, consulting and specializing in organizational development and culture. He is also a survivor of intimate partner violence and is actively working with CAFE to develop programs for male survivors that can be replicated across Canada. Tonight he'll be sharing his story and his path to recovery. Please welcome Michael Healey.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. So, first I'm going to time myself because I have a propensity to go on and on and on. So I want to make sure I stay in my time limits. So thank you, Phil and CAFE for producing this event, and also for the UBC Engineering Department for sponsoring it. And for those of you who are here for coming out. I have a quick question I usually use to get started, so I'm just going to ask it again tonight. And it's simply this. How many of you have somewhere else you could be right now or something else you could be doing? Anybody? Yeah, okay, good. Anybody have nothing else? Okay, just wanted to check. Yeah, so the reason I ask that question is I know your time is valuable and you've invested it here with us tonight, and I appreciate that. So I know our goal is to try and give you some information that might be kind of thought stimulating. Hopefully it'll be interesting and maybe even paradigm expanding for you in some way. So, I want to talk about my story, and it's admittedly anecdotal. And in addition to that, in addition to the story and the anecdote part, is I have been doing a lot of speaking and talking to men around Toronto and Ontario. And one of the interesting things, or interesting and unfortunate things that I found, is when I speak to men, in the groups that I speak to, I find there's a lot of men who have their own story around domestic violence. And for me, that was very interesting. And it drives me because I didn't realize how many men were out there that had some kind of experience of domestic violence. So one of the reasons that I want to talk about it is, well, frankly, it's therapeutic for me, so just to begin with, and it's cathartic to do so. And there's also a narrative out there about domestic violence in society that is not based on the actual statistics and facts and research. And Tonia's here and she's going to be presenting some of those statistics and facts and research. But part of, for me, is just to begin and trying to facilitate a conversation about that. But the main reason, the number one reason, is because there are so many men out there who have experienced domestic violence. And if they're like me, and I'll tell you this in my story, I didn't know what to do and I didn't know where to go and I didn't even recognize it. So I want to speak to that because I speak to a lot of men who, after I talk, they go, oh, I think that might be happening to me or somebody that I know. And even women say, that's happening to my brother or somebody I know or something. So that's my goal. As Phil said, I've been a management consultant for almost 30 years now in Toronto. And I'm also have experienced domestic violence. And one of the interesting things that I find about it is that I actually haven't found the language even yet to describe what I am. I don't like to be called a victim. I don't feel like a victim. I don't feel like a survivor, although I am. On both of those, but I really just, because both of those seem to take away my power somehow. And so I want to find different language for that. I haven't found it yet, but the best that I can do is I've experienced domestic violence. That's what I can say about it. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the myths, and as I bring those myths forward, these are some of that narrative that's out there, and I want to talk about those, and then after we address some of them, I'll give you a little pieces of my story that kind of address those myths. So myth number one is that women aren't as strong as men, and that might be true physically, but there's a lot more to domestic violence than just physical. So when we think about that idea that women aren't as strong as men, again, I think we need to go past the physical because women can abuse men in many different ways, and I'll talk about that, and they certainly have strength in those other ways. The other part is ridiculous to think that a woman could even assault a man. Anybody heard that one before? Kind of that idea that that's don't even talk about that. It's ridiculous. Yeah. Okay. And then the last one is, if it ever happens that a woman does be physical with a man, it's always self-defense. Anybody heard that one? Yeah. Yeah. So let me. For context, I'm just going to give you a little piece of my story. And this happened near the end of a 5-year relationship that I was in, just recent, fairly recent in my life. But the other thing I want to tell you, just for context, is that I have been in violent, abusive relationships my whole adult life, intimate relationships my whole adult life. And I'll put that in context a little bit later. The reason I tell you that is that I had a part in all of this, and that's also why I don't feel like a victim as much, because there was a part of me that allowed it to happen or that stayed, etc. But I'll get into that. So here's the context I want to give you. I just want you to picture this. The woman that I'm living with, cohabitating, over a 5-year period, the violence had escalated. It started out with mostly criticism and demeaning, and then it started getting into abusive language, calling me names, using things that she knew I was vulnerable about against me in the criticism. And then it kind of escalated into really yelling and rage, and she was slamming doors all the time. And then that escalated into throwing things at me, and that started very small. It started with, I think the very first time, it was one of those little 2-inch by 2-inch post-it note things. She threw at me and it hit me in the chest. Didn't hurt, but she threw it at me. And then that escalated into bigger things, cups and bowls, and eventually got to a frying pan, a cast iron frying pan that came at me. Fortunately, she missed. And then that escalated into hitting me, punching me, slapping me. I know this one's kind of funny. Pulling my hair. It wasn't this hair. It was, here. She'd grab me by the chest and yank and pull hair out. It's more painful than it sounds. And then that escalated into this incident that I'm about to tell you. And what the other interesting thing about all of this is that when these incidents happened, when the violence happened, it was like a switch went. One moment, we were having a normal, benign conversation, just like a normal conversation. She was a normal, human being. And then within a second, and there didn't seem to be anything that I could attach to that caused the switch. I reviewed those things over and over again. But this day, standing in the kitchen, she was chopping vegetables with a knife, 10-inch, chopping knife. Benign conversation, and so the switch went. She actually had her back to me. She turned around, and I could tell, blind rage. Her eyes were unseeing, veins in her neck popping out, her jaw muscles tight, and she started walking towards me with that knife. She's probably about 6 feet away when she started. And I said, please put the knife down. Please put the knife down. And she kept coming towards me, kept walking towards me with that knife. And in that moment, I had a choice, clearly. I could try and defend myself and disarm her or something, or I could continue to try and talk her out of it, but that clearly wasn't working. What I actually did was I ran away. I just turned around and ran and got out of the kitchen, out the door, I actually was in my bare feet, wandered around the neighborhood for a couple of hours, went to the park, and then come home, and by that time she'd gone to bed, and we were in separate rooms by that time, so I didn't see her again. But that was a real critical moment for me, and I want to take that to this myth right here. Women aren't as strong as men. That may be true physically. But one of the pieces of information, and this is not empirical either, but a lot of the stories that I hear from men, and including mine, is they use weapons, they use all kinds of other things, and including, and we'll get into this, psychological and emotional abuse as well. But when it is physical, they often use weapons. And that was my experience. She had hit me a number of times with her fists and slapped me. It was always in muscle mass, so there's never any marks on me or nothing that anybody could look at. And the other part about it is that she was literally half my weight, half my size. And I didn't think about it in the moment, but I just reacted when she was coming at me with the knife. But I thought about it afterwards, and I thought, wow, I'm really glad that I didn't try and disarm her, because it probably wouldn't have gone well. Somebody would have gotten cut. It was a very sharp knife. And I suspect, I don't know this for sure, but I suspect no matter which one of us got cut, if the police arrived, who are they going to think was the perpetrator? Me, yeah. And since that incident, and since I've talked to a lot of men, I hear story after story after story. I know there's a referral bias. These are men that have been in that situation. But there's story after story of men who have been abused themselves and then gotten taken away by the police when the police arrived, guys that got stabbed and they actually had a stab wound and, had the knife, and the police came and took them away and put them in jail. Someone that I know in Toronto actually had his wife and his daughter, put him on the ground and punch and kick him and stomp on him, and he was bruised all over his body. They kept him in the house, kidnapped him for 4 hours. He couldn't get out. He finally got out, went to the neighbors, called the police. The police came, talked to all three parties, I guess, and he went to jail that night in handcuffs. So that's myth number one. Myth number two is that, women can't actually hurt men, and I've talked a little bit about the physical part, but I want to talk about some of the other parts about how people, men specifically, can get hurt in these relationships. And the other thing I want to say right off the very bat, I'm going to talk about men because, as I said, there's a narrative out there that I believe we hear a lot about how almost all violence and domestic violence is perpetrated against women by men. And in fact, that's even supported institutionally. In Ontario, the Ontario government website, if you go on there and type in domestic violence, you come to a page on domestic violence that says 86% of all domestic violence is perpetrated by men against women. And Tonia's going to talk about some of those stats that it's just not true. And she will, you'll be surprised actually maybe if you haven't heard the numbers before at what the numbers actually are. I'm not going to take away your thunder other than that. But the other ways that people get hurt in these situations, I'll give you some of my experience, is that, so here's where I ended up at the end of 5 years of being in this relationship. I ended up, the last 5 months particularly, it got to a point where that switch that I talked about went. In the beginning, it would go off every maybe 2% of the time. And I saw it a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, and it got more and more and more, progressively more. The last 5 months, she was basically in that mode pretty much 100% of the time. We were in separate rooms at that time. I would stay in my room most of the time. If I ever left my room to go get food or go to the bathroom or whatever, literally she would knock on the bathroom door and say, "When are you coming out of there? You've been in there a long time. Are you sick? What's wrong with you?" Like I just literally walked in. Or she'd follow me into the kitchen, and the word I use for it is harangue me. So the harangues would be, again, criticizing, demeaning, trying to poke at areas that she knew that I was vulnerable. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that she did later on. But I also want to say up front that I say these things not because I want to perpetrator blame. I don't want to blame the perpetrator. What I want to do, though, is inform men who may be in the circumstance what it actually looks like. And one of the reasons why I say that is because for me, even up to the very end, if someone had asked me, "Are you being abused?" I would have said no. I didn't see it as abuse. I just didn't see it as abuse. And that's a problem for men if we don't see it as abuse. The other reason I want to talk about it is because, for this reason, if someone had asked me a split second before she started walking at me with that knife, if I thought my life was in danger in this relationship, I would have said no. And so if it truly is, a lot of the cases are progressive, and the ones that I know about are progressive, then the reality is if a man is in a situation where a woman is violent or abusive, then your life could be in danger and you don't know it. So for me, that's important that you hear that, and if you know somebody that's in that situation, try and get them some help. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's one of the reasons why I share this, is because I didn't know that I was in danger until I was in danger. And then it was almost too late. So the last 5 months, I was basically held hostage in my room. If I came out, she'd follow me around and harangue me and criticize me and so on. If I didn't come out, she would come and stand in the door and harangue me and criticize me. And if I got up and said, can you please move out of the way, she'd actually brace herself in the door so I couldn't get out. So I was literally a captive in that room. I was also physically, I couldn't walk. I couldn't walk across this room without losing my breath, heart rate increase up like twice what it normally is, and feeling like I was going to pass out. I thought I had serious heart disease. I had pain in my body, in my stomach, in my solar plexus, in my back, in my shoulders. I couldn't expand my lungs to get a breath. I thought I might have cancer because I just was so tight in my midsection. And then the other part about it was I lost my brain, is the easiest way for me to say it. I couldn't think. I couldn't string a sentence together. I couldn't remember. And that actually played into some of her strategies, her tactics, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But, I have a reasonable intellect. I have actually a pretty good memory generally overall, but I got to a point where I couldn't even remember what had happened yesterday. And the best illustration of that I can give you is this. When I finally decided to leave, which was not long after the knife incident, because within the next week, while I was in bed sleeping at about 11, after 11 o'clock at night, she was standing outside my door actually screaming, I'm going to kill him, I'm going to kill him, I'm going to kill him. She did that twice. I didn't get a lot of sleep those nights. So I decided I was going to leave, and I downloaded some information off the internet that talked about creating an emergency escape plan, something like that, an emergency plan. And one of the things they suggested is if you're going to go, make a list of things you want to take with you, things that are important, things you'll need. So I decided to do that. And so I had 2 weeks to do it. And that was really my main task. It was at top of my to-do list every day for those 2 weeks. Any guesses on how many actual items I got on my to-do list or my take-with-me list? Well, just slightly more than that. So it's 0. But yeah, I got 4 things on my list. 2 weeks. Full-time, on task, I could only think of 4 things. I literally could have just looked around my environment and wrote down more than 4 things, but I couldn't get my brain organized. I just couldn't organize. I couldn't think. And so when we talk about, can women hurt men, what's the answer? Absolutely. Absolutely. In so many more ways than just physical. And men do this to women as well. So I'm not just saying it only happens one direction. It happens both directions. However, the narrative out there is this one, not the other one. The other narrative isn't there. The other one that says men can't hurt women isn't out there. This one is out there. So I wanted to speak to that one. Okay, so moving on, I want to talk a little bit about, when I talk about what intimate partner violence is, again, I want to give you a little bit of a sense of what some of the things are. And I know, Tonia, you're going to go into even more detail than this, but I want to kind of make it, I would say, I know you're going to talk about the research, and I want to talk more about kind of the context of kind of what it looks like in our lives. So intimate partner violence can also be called domestic violence, domestic abuse, partner violence. Intimate partner violence tends to encompass dating relationships as well, whereas domestic abuse seems to be more oriented towards cohabitating couples, etc. So IPV includes dating. And there are some categories that are used by researchers and government bodies, the CDC, Center for Disease Control in the US. And I'm just going to give you 5 of them. Different organizations and researchers will use different ones, but for the sake of this discussion, we'll use these 5. And the first one is physical. Physical violence. It includes slapping and hitting and choking and kicking, and also threatening to hit and choke, or threatening things to do physically to the person. Even if they're throwing things at you and not hitting you, it's still considered physical violence. The next one is psychological violence, and those are things that I spoke about a little earlier. There's a term that's called gaslighting, and basically, to go really quickly about it, gaslighting is, to use a non-technical term, it's crazy making. And one of the things that she would do is she would say one thing on one day, say X, and I would say the next day, say, oh, you said X, and she goes, no, I didn't. I said Y. Now, the first time she said that to me, I was kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, she's wrong, no problem. The 50th, 60th, 100th time she said that to me, I was kind of like, I wonder what's going on. Like, I'm sure she said X, and I've got a pretty good memory, but maybe it is me. The 200th time she said it, was like, wow, I must have a real problem. And so after a period of time, I actually started questioning my own thinking. Was I even sane? Was I a sentient human being? I didn't know. I couldn't figure it out. And so that affected my decision making, because I couldn't make any decisions because I didn't know whether I was making any sense to myself or not, And I actually didn't know what was real and what wasn't real after a while. I started really questioning my own ability to sense reality. The other part about psychological is various ways of stalking or keeping tabs on. So she would do things like, and again, I'm kind of getting into some of the details here, but she would do things like we only had one car, which we decided, we lived in an urban environment, so we used public transit a lot. The one car, when I had business engagements, I would take the car, and she would actually, I found out later, or some point in time, she was tracking the mileage. And the way I found out was one day, the next day, after I'd gone to this business trip, I'd come back, and she said to me, there was 30 extra kilometers on the car last night from where you should have been going. I did it on, Google Maps. Where were you? And then I told her, which I had just gone, to a sports store to buy some hockey equipment. And she said, you're a liar. Show me the hockey equipment. Prove to me that that's where you went. Where's the receipt? Where's the equipment? I want to see the store. I want to see the equipment. So that's that looking at, trying to control all pieces. And there was other things that she did. Again, on the schedule, when we first started, living together and only had one car, she would tell me her schedule all the time, weeks in advance. I've got this happening, I got this happening, I got this happening. After a while, it started getting, she wouldn't tell me, and then the car wasn't home when I needed it, or I'd tell her I needed it on Wednesday night for something. I needed it at 7 o'clock, and she'd come home at 8, and she'd say, oh, yeah, no, I had this, that sort of stuff. So it's all, again, part of control, but that's psychological abuse, basically. The other part is, another thing that she did, and this is kind of common, is she'd go through my computer, she'd go through my phone, check on things. And one of the ones that I can now look at it and it's kind of comical, but at the time it wasn't, is in my business, I'm on Skype all day long. I'm talking to people, I'm texting and back and forth, messaging on Skype. And when you're on Skype, for those of you who are men in the audience, and you have a male's picture up there and you're open all day long, you get a lot of cam models contacting you saying, I want to be your friend, or I want to, connect with you. And you I block them, I don't know what you do. I block them, and, just block them, and that's it, But you can't get them out of your history, or I haven't figured out how. So she one day started confronting me about all these young women, or at least they may be men, but they have women's pictures and women's names, all these young women in my Skype history, and she was accusing me of having phone sex with them because she was seeing them all day long. And so she'd say, oh, you're home having phone sex all day long. And so the next time one of them came in and she was there, I actually took my computer to her and said, see, this is just and then she got really mad at me because I was actually showing it to her and I was being disrespectful to her. Anyway, lots of just psychological, almost torture that was going on. The next one is emotional abuse. And they can be to me, they seem fairly similar, and maybe Tonia, you'll be able to slice and dice it a little bit more. But for me, emotional abuse is things like she used to, I brought a dog into the relationship. We had the dog and I had a very close relationship. And she would do things, she was mean to the dog. She would kick the dog, and she would, abuse me around the dog and threaten to hurt the dog, or not let me buy things for the dog. And she tried to throw coffee on the dog one time. She also got this is an emotional abuse as well, getting in the way of relationships. So I had 2 children from another relationship. They were about 17, 18 years old when I got into this relationship. So they were almost adults. But she created an environment for those boys when they came to our house that was at minimum uncomfortable and at the worst hostile. So after a while, they didn't want to come to the house anymore. And she would do things, as an example, and again, I put these examples out there not to blame her, but so that if anybody sees this in their relationships, it's important. So she would do things like, the history I had with both of my boys is that on their birthday, I would cook them dinner. They would decide what they want, I would cook it, to the degree that I could actually do that. But anyway, then I would try. So I had a dinner set up with my oldest son for a Saturday. We had gone through the menu, we decided what we were gonna do, both boys were coming, my partner was gonna be there, I was gonna be there, and at 1 o'clock she said, I can't do it tonight. You'll have to do something else. So at 1 o'clock I had to rearrange with them. And they picked up on it after a while, they're not stupid. They got it, that there was something going on. And what began to happen was I began to get alienated from them because they didn't think I was protecting them like a father should from that abuse. So she was actually abusing my kids as a way of getting at me, and abusing my dog as a way of getting at me. So that's can be emotional abuse. The next one is sexual. I didn't experience that except in the form of no sex. I know that doesn't count as abuse, but it is part of the whole pattern. Because what literally happened is we were living separately when we first met, of course, and we did that for about 1.5 years, and then we decided we were going to move in together, and we were having regular sex during that period of time. And I say this literally, it almost sounds facetious, but literally, I moved in August, and we never had sex again, ever, in the course of that relationship. And it wasn't from my lack of willingness or lack of, initiation, let's say. She always, in the beginning, she had many excuses, just some of them were reasonable and some of them are not, washed my hair, it's too early in the morning, it's too late at night, it's too Saturday, it's too Sunday, it was just always something. And after a while, after 6 or 8 months, I just got to the place where it was too frustrating for me to even initiate anything, so nothing happened after a while. But that again is kind of a form of control, which is what she did with the car. And the last, but having said that, I do know quite a few men who are sexually abused, and in the actual, legal definition of sexual abuse by women, who are raped on a regular basis. Although sometimes in some jurisdictions now, rape has to be penetration, so the men aren't actually penetrated, but they are the penetrator, but it's still, it's sexual abuse. And the last one is legal administrative abuse, and that's where a partner uses the system basically to abuse their partner, and that can look like calling the police and making false allegations. It can look like using the court system to get custody of the children, or even threatening to do that, the court system to custody of the children. It can look like what was I going to say? Again, false allegations not against the partner, but against the children. There was sexual abuse of the children, or there was, physical abuse of the children. So it can look like a lot of those things. Oh, and also using the system to basically financially bankrupt the other partner. So, so those are what some of those things look like, some of what they looked in my life. I didn't have the sexual abuse or the legal administrative abuse, but there are many men that have experienced that. So the third and last myth that I want to speak to is that men can just leave. Right? Men can just leave. Why don't they just leave? They have all the power, they have all the resources. Why don't they just leave? Why stay around? Well, there's a few reasons, but I want to talk about mine. And part of mine was this, is that it happened very slow. If she had been doing the things that she was doing 5 years into the relationship on day one, I probably would have left. But it just happened very, very slowly. I invested in the relationship. I became invested in the relationship. There's quite a few other things that happened for me specifically. But the interesting thing that I want to share with you here is that I've, again, spoken with a lot of men. This is not empirical research, very anecdotal, very experiential. But what I find so interesting is almost all the men that I speak to, when we get into the details of their story, the details might differ a little bit, but the arc is the same. we all experience the same arc of what happened in the relationship. And a lot of that is it goes slow, starts off slow, they're loving, compassionate, people, and then over a period of time, things start happening. What they actually do can be different, but the timing and the patterns of it, very, very similar. So it happens over and over again for men. For me, one of the reasons that I didn't leave is I actually thought it was my job to help her. And one of the ways I know that now, I didn't necessarily know it then, although the first time I did go to a psychologist late in the relationship, and one of the first things I said to the psychologist when I got there is, the psychologist says, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Well, I'm here because my partner has emotional dysregulation," because she was flying off the handle regularly, "and I want to be more empathetic and compassionate. I don't think I'm not helping her. A partner is there, to help. A soulmate should help that person with their problems. And I wasn't doing a good enough job. So I went to a therapist to be a better helper of someone with emotional dysregulation. So that was my job. And I know that now because I've had some therapy, and I'm getting into some of the recovery stuff now, but I've had some therapy and some work in groups and so on. And I realized that 2 weeks into the relationship was her first emotional dysregulation with me. And she was coming to my house. It was a night like tonight. It was a November night. It was rainy. It was dark. She was supposed to be coming at 7. It was dark and rainy. She was supposed to be there at 7. Didn't get there till about 7:30. She arrived at 7:30, and I said, "Oh, so glad that you made it, blah, blah, blah." And she was pissed. And she was pissed at me. And she was pissed at me because she couldn't find my house. And I should have done more to help her find my house. I had sent her a map. And by the way, it wasn't hidden. It was in a subdivision. It had a number on it, and a light was on the number. What I found out later was she was always late. So I don't even think that she couldn't find it. I think she was just late, and that's her, whatever her psychological makeup was, she needed to blame it on somebody else. And that's another thing, is if you feel like you're getting blamed a lot for things that aren't your fault, that's part of the pattern as well. So anyway, but here's the interesting thing. So she was upset at me because she couldn't find my house. And I think somebody that wasn't dysfunctional, and I think I was certainly dysfunctional because I'd had a succession of these relationships in my life, they might have thought, "Oh, you know what? She's got a problem, let's kind of track this and see what happens over time, but be aware of it." Or I might have thought, I don't want anything to do with this person. Just goodbye and, have a good life. What I thought actually was, oh, here's a person I can help. And I remember that I had that thought. I thought, oh, I can help this person. And so that was the beginning of it. And it was actually, it became my job to help her. And no matter how dysfunctional or bad it got, I had to work harder. That's all. I wasn't working hard enough. That was the problem. It wasn't anything to do with her. It was I wasn't working hard enough. So that's one of the reasons why men stay, at least this man. I didn't see it as abuse. And I hear this over and over and over again from men. We just don't see it as abuse. If we saw the exact same thing happening to a woman, we'd say, that's abuse, that's wrong. And we see it happening to men and we go, it's not that big of a deal. And yet it's the exact same behaviors. And we just don't see it. So part of it is we, as men, need to change our paradigms about what abuse actually is. Because we're not seeing it, a lot of us. The other one was embarrassment and shame as time went along. It wasn't in the beginning, but as time went along, as I got less and less of my own resources and as my brain started bleeding, I couldn't imagine telling everybody. And the other part of that that's linked to that is that I didn't think anybody would believe me in any case. Because I didn't have any bruises. I didn't have anything. So what am I going to go and tell people? She's talking mean to me? That's what I thought. Anyway, that's what was going on in my head. I didn't think anybody, and plus she was half my size, This woman that's half my size is abusing me. I really didn't think anybody was going to believe me. And then the last one, which the last three all kind of fit together, is I actually thought it was my fault. I thought the relationship was my fault. And that's classic within these types of relationships as well. With the men that I talk to, they all think it's their fault. They all stick in because they're trying to fix it. We think it's our job to fix it. And there may be some anthropological reasons for that, So, that men think we have to fix things, but we certainly think we have to fix it. And then the last piece about that I don't have on here is there's something called, I think in psychology, it's intermittent reinforcement schedule. And so basically what would happen, and I look back at this now and I can see it so clearly, but I didn't see it at the time, is that every once in a while she'd be really nice to me, really nice. And so I would think, oh yeah, this is the loving, compassionate, connected relationship that I want, and I know it's possible. And if I can just change, I can get this. And then the next day I'd be back to the other. But because I got a taste of it, it would draw me back in. It would suck me back in. And I don't know whether whether it was conscious, intentional, but it certainly was a pattern that happened over and over again. So, now I just want to talk a little bit about my recovery. So how I actually got out was I had gone to the psychologist, and she had, on a couple occasions, kind of said, this is an abusive relationship. Maybe you should take some time, get away from it. And I just couldn't hear her. Even though she was saying those words, I could not hear them. And it wasn't until I went to the medical doctor to get tests on all the things I thought I was dying from, heart disease and cancer and whatever else. We went through all the tests, and everything showed up negative. And my GP kind of looked me in the eye and said, everything's negative. What's going on? What else is going on, I think is what she said. And for some reason I told her. I just told her what was on. And what she said to me, and this is what got me out, was she said to me, get out of that relationship. It's killing you. And I think she thought physically, but it was also killing me in so many other ways, that she wasn't all completely aware of. But it was killing me. And I think if I had stayed, I would have been dead, either at her hands or just my body would have shut down because I was getting to that point. I couldn't hardly get out of bed anymore. So that was the beginning. And so one of the reasons I tell that story, that piece of that story, is that if you know people that are in this situation, I really encourage you, or if you are one, I really encourage you to tell somebody about it and then listen to what they say. So talk to them. And I think it's good to get the emotional support from friends and family and so on, but talk to a professional, whether it's a GP or a counselor of some kind. Find somebody to talk to, or somebody at a crisis line or a crisis center, because they can start telling you what it really is. Sometimes your friends will say, oh, just get over it, don't worry about it. Everybody has ups and downs in their relationships. I know when I started telling my friends after the fact that of all my friends, only about 10% really got it. They really went, oh, okay, I get what happened. The other ones were kind of like, oh, that's too bad, They didn't really get it, and still don't. And then there was some that literally after I told them, we have never talked about it again. They just really don't want to have that conversation with me. I'm not sure why, but they don't want to have it. So, so then on my path, so I have been doing a tremendous amount of therapy, well, at least relative to me, which means like 3 or 4 times a week I've been going to see a variety of trauma therapists, and I highly recommend a trauma therapist. I've tried other ones, but trauma is really the way to go because it is a traumatic thing that happened. I haven't been diagnosed with it because I haven't seen a psychiatrist, who are the ones that can do this diagnosis, but I believe that I had PTSD, that I was actually living PTSD without the P. I had the traumatic experiences, and I was going through it day in and day out. And I think I still probably have the PTSD, but that's those symptoms are resolving. But see somebody that's, a trauma specialist if you have that type of situation. That's my recommendation. And do it on a regular basis. Don't go once or twice. It does take time to heal and to understand what happened. And I am really actually thankful for this relationship. I know that sounds weird. It was very tough to go through, but I had a succession of those relationships over my life and time. And if this one hadn't got to that level of intensity, I wouldn't have had to look at myself to figure out why I kept going back to those relationships. So I would have continued in relationships like that for the rest of my life. And I think I'm getting to a place now where I believe I can go into a relationship that's not like that. I can have a healthy relationship. And the thing that had to change was me. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I'm starting to heal that part of me that needed to be healed so I could have those relationships. But the first thing that I had to do was get the trauma response down, because my body was just vibrating from trauma. Everything was triggering me. I would see a car on the street that looked like her car, and I was up at high levels of anxiety, So So it takes time, find a trauma specialist, and that's the other reason that I'm actually here in Vancouver. Phil talked about it a little bit. I work with as a volunteer with the Canadian Centre for Men and Families in Toronto. They provide a lot of free services, and we're trying to roll those services out to CAFE offices across Canada. So part of my goal is to, help the different CAFE offices, Vancouver and other ways, to start bringing some of these services. And we're hoping that we can bring a domestic violence, men who've experienced domestic violence group to Vancouver. So we're working on getting that going, as well as the legal group that Phil was talking about. So just a few things. The last thing that I was just putting in, the other reason that I stayed is there weren't any services for men. I tried shelters, I tried all kinds of things, and I couldn't find anything in the Greater Toronto area. I was very lucky that someone referred me to the Canadian Centre for Men and Families after the fact, in about 3 or 4 months after, and somebody found it for me and got me there. So, but I think in Toronto, that's really the only services for men. So we want to change that. It's just, there's men out there who are suffering, and we need to bring services to them. That's the bottom line. So if you are that person, or you know somebody that's suffering, and you want to get a referral, this is the number for the CAFE office in Vancouver. And if you want, I'm going to put some resources up on this next page, but if you want to get the list of resources I'm going to put up, and don't have to copy them down now, just text this number and say resources, and Phil or administrative staff or whomever will send you a list of the resources. So these are the different ones right now that have some resources for men. So there's the Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse. Obviously, that name speaks for itself. Men's Resource Center. Phil, is that an individual psychologist or counselor?
An individual.
Yeah, an individual. Okay, so that's a psychologist or counselor. And how about the Men's Trauma Center? Is that on the island? Is it in Victoria?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay. So those are some numbers, and that just really illustrates the point is there's very little out there for men. In a province the size of BC, there's like 3, and CAFE. So, okay, we will have a question and answer after Tonia talks, so that's my talk for today. I really appreciate your time and attention and engagement, so thank you very much, and if you have questions, feel free to ask them after Tonia. Thank you.